Welcome to PREKURE Prevention is Cure AMA podcast. Prof Grant Schofield here, joined with the other part of our R&D team, Kayla. Hey, Kayla.
Hey, yeah. Excited? Let's go.
Yeah. Goal is to answer your questions. So email us info@precure.com or through our various social media platforms. You'll find us. Various PREKURE ones, just Google them up, or if you want to have our students. A lot of this stuff is based on our student cohorts, because remember we have the health coaching students, advanced certificate in nutrition students, and advanced certificate in mental health. So we're sort of covering all of those topics. But I think today is more of a nutrition one, Kayla.
Yeah, so today we're going to take a closer look at obesity and what we've come to know and understand about obesity and how that's changed really from a calories in, calories out sort of model to something a little bit more nuanced and taking into account the different aspects of basically the body and how that has an impact. And I think I'd like to start with the question, Grant, if that's okay with you. So in the previous podcast, we chatted about the stats around prediabetes and adolescence, which were quite frankly shocking. And it's no secret that we're getting fatter and sicker. And it's not just an issue in the developed world anymore. It really is, it's far reaching. So there used to be this idea that, oh, well, only people in the West and the developed world get diabetes, but that's not the case anymore. So what do you think could be going on here? Like, what's at play?
Yeah, well, obviously the food environment's changed, the physical activity environment's changed. I suppose calling the whole environment ultra process includes the way that we have artificial light, which is a good thing. It's great to have lights, but we've created a world which doesn't match the genotype.
Yeah.
At least the sort of way that remember, human genotype wasn't selected to be a perfect genotype. It was just selected to work quite well in particular environments. When that environment's not on a match, there's a complexity of biochemistry and physiology that's going on here that means things don't go quite right. If they're not going right, then you can't be as healthy and as fit and as useful as you were, and can't return to a sort of normal metabolic or cognitive homeostasis, and you've got problems. And then the question is, well, is it just obesity in of itself, or is it just really a marker, an obvious marker? You can sort of see it, what's going on.
Yeah.
That's actually more likely to be true, because I've for the longest time been going, we're getting too fat. And I sort of felt that was, first of all, sort of negative health, really. It's like you're too fat, sort it out. And then I was like, actually, it's pretty hard to lose weight once you've got a problem. And actually, is it just a marker of what's going on somewhere in between? I was sort of really settling on that is the problem with obesity, is that it's not the be all and end all. Obesity itself might be technically a disease now, but it's not really the problem. That's sort of a marker so much. And actually, we had a few papers lined up today, Kayla. We're talking about the Mozaffarian one that's just come out.
Yeah.
That was interesting, bit of epidemiology.
That one's really interesting, and he puts out some amazing commentary type pieces that get you thinking. And I think really we've been in this sort of 50-year experiment of processed food, and what this paper is really saying is, actually, if you look at it, the whole adage of, oh, if you just ate less and moved more, well, then you'd lose some weight. And he had a look at some of the US statistics, and the reason for that is because, well, the US tends to collect a lot of data, and so do the UK, and so that's where a lot of these papers are based. And what he saw is that actually people are moving more, and people are consuming less calories, but we're still seeing obesity rates climb exponentially. We're still seeing diabetes rates climb. We're still seeing all non-communicable disease rates climb on a year basis. And so if it was just that people needed to be more active and eat less food, well, then surely we would have fixed the problem by now.
Yeah, and then the counter, well, first of all, this is Dariush Mozaffarian, who's a cardiologist. He's pretty well credentialed, pretty well published, and has a lot to say about food. He's not been shy, into things like the saturated fat debate, and even when he was on some part of the board or the medical director, or can't remember exactly which, of the American Heart Association. So kudos to him. He's had a lot to say about conflicts of interest in medicine. He's sort of probably most known for talking about the food environment, not picking out single nutrients like saturated fat or whatever, but talking more about the food matrix, because foods don't come with single nutrients. They always have whole sort of, preference. And he's sort of starting to use the labels that I like, which is one end you've got ultra processed food, whole food. So those are good things to deal with. This specific paper is interesting on a few things because you go, well, you get these self-reported dietary recalls from adults. He uses the NHANES study, which is a big representative sample over decades in the US, and he goes, well, people's actual reported calories have actually decreased slightly, and that could be true. The problem is that these dietary recalls aren't very good instruments, but at least he's the same one across that time. It's confounded by the fact that the more obese you get, the more you underreport your calories. So you can see the problem there. So in pure lay terms, the fatter you are, the more you lie is the way of saying it. It's
pretty awful.
So it's not really this way you need to say it, but it's like you see the problem is that there's a confounding figure. But what he actually also does is use FTO, so trade data about food availability, which actually has its own problem as well, but doesn't suffer from that problem. And he sees higher amounts reported per person in the FTO data, but actually exactly the same trend across time. So that's sort of consistent with that. And obviously there's a difference there because some food being available and food being eaten is a different thing.
Yeah.
Because some gets wasted. Who knows where it goes. But and you miss some of it. And so that's interesting. And then he's also got obviously obesity that's measured accurately, and that's gone way up over that 30, 40 year period. And then there's a question of activity. I frankly take that with a grain of salt, having been in that field for most of my career.
Yep.
Asking people to remember how much they moved is so fraught.
Yes.
And they remember purposeful activity, which is fine. But one of the arguments is that incidental activity has been engineered out of our lives. So whether that's true or not, I don't think we actually know that. And then you get people going the other way. This is the sort of late 90s argument, gluttony or sloth, what's the problem? And they put surrogates for that, like cars and car miles traveled, car trips and screen time and that sort of thing. But nonetheless, I think there's evidence that we somehow just haven't started stuffing ourselves with more food. Maybe it's the type of food is what his argument is. And so I most probably agree with that. Gone to an ultra-processed food environment away from a whole food environment. But looks at, gosh, you go back to the 50s and 60s and look at pictures of just the general public on the beach.
Yes.
Or military recruits when it's compulsory conscription. By modern standards, wow. Or my favourite is just, and I've even done this myself, go back and look at your classroom photos in early primary school.
Yep.
For me, which was in the mid-1970s. And compare that to a modern classroom with the same age kids now, it's a completely different phenotype that's really presenting itself, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's interesting because you could go back. I mean, I'm a little younger than you, Grant, and I was in primary school in the early 2000s, and I can even see a massive change in that short space of time, 2 sort of decades. And I find that quite worrisome. And I think it does definitely talk to the fact that food is not just more hyper palatable than it's ever been, but the availability is certainly increased. I don't know about you, but I remember as a kid when things ran out in the house, they ran out. Like if cheese ran out on a Wednesday, cool. So shopping is on a Saturday, we wait till then. But now there's convenience stores open all the time. You could just pop out and get food. You can get food delivered to you. And the food that you're having delivered to you has a real impact on sort of the addictive pathways in the brain. I mean, it's designed to make you want more and eat more.
Yeah, mind you were in South Africa, so I'm not, to be fair, we today we in my household we are out of cheese, milk, cream, yogurt, and nuts, and we do need to do something about that.
I suppose in a low carb household, you definitely need to do something about that.
Yeah. So I'm actually running out of head for a couple of days, but that's all fine. Anyway, so that's the first paper, but I suppose we want to talk about this. There's a special issue. Oh, by the way, I put the links up to all these things on our website with the show notes and all that sort of stuff. So there's a couple of really interesting papers. One led by Rob Lustig, who's a colleague, a pediatric endocrinologist, but really a pretty famous advocate for food quality, food regulation, food supply. And he's written, tell us about that paper, Kayla.
Yeah, so this is a really cool paper, and I want to just preface this by it is heavy reading. I remember Grant sending this through to me and being like, we're going to discuss this on our next podcast. And I thought, cool, no problem. I'll give it a read. Started reading the first bit about different DNA transcription factors and was like, oh no, how am I going to understand this? So if you are keen on reading the paper, I would advise you to skim the first part and really focus your attention on the second half of the paper. I think that's where the real gold is in terms of basic level understanding. And this
And what's the title of the paper?
So this paper is called Obesity 1, Overview and Molecular Biochemical Mechanisms. So it's the first paper in a 3-part review series. And what this really looks at is all of the molecular and biochemical mechanisms that underpin the progression of obesity or that go beyond calories in, calories out. And I think I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but I think just to prime everyone, my favorite quote out of this paper is, obesity is a multifunctional, multi-tissue, multi-hormone, multi-receptor, and multi-mechanism disease. And the reason that I like that is it goes beyond just one very narrow view of obesity and looks at the whole body and everything that's going on right down to the smallest sort of molecule in the body.
Yeah, I agree with that. And what I like about this is there's been quite a debate in nutrition over the last few years. It's really been two personalities pitted against each other. Kevin Hall with the game, it's all about calories and that sort of thing. I suppose also there's a third personality, Stefan Gunet, is going, actually, there's a dopamine and addictive pathway that's the driver of hypercaloric food's the driver. And you've got David Ludwig from Harvard going, well, no, actually, it's an insulin hypothesis. Insulin is the kingmaker of these hormones. And so to understand obesity, we just really need to concentrate on that part. And of course, they're all right. But I think what I like about what Lustig's done here is he's taken all of the multiple places where human homeostasis can be led astray, and it results in a pathway of energy accumulated as fat, downregulation of activity, upregulation of inflammatory and anabolic processes. So I think he takes Ludwig's great work and I think advances it to another level of complexity. And I know David Ludwig quite well, and he's a really smart and good guy. So I'm not depriving any of his work. I think it's part of it. And I think David will be the first to agree with Lustig here. But he's going, well, if you're picking a target, then probably this insulin is a good place to see that target. So this paper, as you say, this is not for the faint-hearted. It's complex, but I think standout things for me. Insulin is a key hormone metabolically, as is the idea of insulin resistance, but insulin resistance occurs differently across different tissues. There's insulin resistance in the liver, there's peripheral insulin resistance in the muscles, he talks about brain insulin resistance, which is a new one to me.
Yeah.
And so there's those factors. There's obviously other key hormones around, and there's several of those. There's ghrelin to do with stomach stretch of those receptors. There's leptin to do with being secreted by your fat cells and trapped into the hypothalamus. Is the idea of leptin resistance in the brain. There's the incretin hormones, which are affected by different qualities of carbohydrate. So there's all that going on. Then there's a whole bunch of neurological things in the mesolimbic system and dopamine and those whole pathways and nucleus accumbens. There's a whole bunch of gene transcription and other factors, which frankly, I have no idea how to interpret at all. But, what do we take from this? We're dealing with complex biochemistry because we've created a food environment which has a complete mismatch between what we evolved in and what we're in now. And so there are some simple messages that come out of this. It might be a multi-functional, multi-hormone, multi-neurotransmitter, multi-neural, multi-feedback system, but the mismatch is an important thing to understand. And if we can more favorably match that, then we're getting somewhere. And I suppose at least academically, we need to move away from arguing simple models versus or just eat less and all this sort of stuff. It's clearly a complicated system. We don't fully understand it, but we do know some of the key things. I still think Ludwig's got a great point with the carbohydrate insulin model because by far and away that seems to be, for many people, where that homeostasis has gone wrong. So he's right to attack it from that point of view, at least in my mind. But Lustig goes to the next level. Okay, so let's talk about there's a second paper here which it has really interested me. Yeah, so my view here, so this has been this I've been brought to this kicking and streaming basically by Kayla, by a couple of my other students that you know well, Fern, Chrissy, others have. I've been talking about the nutrient aspects of food, low nutrient density, high amounts of sugar, high energy density, lots of processed seed oils, high sugar, that sort of stuff. And everyone's always adding on, it's all about the additives as well. Who knows what this chemical is and that chemical is, and there's bisphenols and glycophosphates. And I was like, yeah, well, most probably, but I don't know how you do the science and the epidemiology. And I don't think it's there yet to figure that out. How do you discover these things? And, the people exposed to bisphenols versus not, given it's ubiquitous, more or less, in most parts of the world. And these things, so I've sort of gone, actually, until this paper came along, which I think is really a game changer. A big set of authors in a field that I haven't fully understood until now go through and start to unpack a range of food additives or things that get into the food supply from the environment. Things like bisphenols, so sort of from plastics, the way that food and water liquids are stored, through to things that are in other synthetic things in the environment like vinyls and formaldehydes and these sorts of things, through to a whole bunch of other additives that might occur. And they systematically go through and list the levels of evidence from biological plausibility through to epidemiology and experimentation and animal to human research and where the evidence is at. And actually, in 2022, there's now compelling evidence to show that there's multiple harms from these. Including things like bisphenols, especially, and other things. It's really a good read, and the graphics in this paper are really good. I advise you to go and have a look. Things that and it's fundamentally changed my own behaviour. So here's a good example. While I'm all for a whole food diet and avoiding ultra processed food in the pathological environment, I have had my vices. I have been occasionally prone to having artificial sweetened drinks. I could have a Diet Coke, which is disgusting, I agree, but still. And sometimes I'll have some gum and these sorts of things. This paper has switched me completely off having those things. I'm not doing them. And so I've had 100% ban on artificial sweeteners and those types of foods since I read this paper. And, I do feel better for that, I suppose. And this paper really helped convince me to do that. And you might go, well, you're a professor and this stuff, and you should have known better to start with, whatever. So I should have, but I think it's a really compelling thing. What's your take out from this paper, Kayla? Given you've been telling me this stuff for years anyway.
I think I've been pretty bent on this sort of field for a while now, and I'm still only scraping the surface in terms of understanding. But for me, the real thing, I feel like the most compelling one is probably not just additives, but BPA. So bisophenyl A, it's a type of plastic. It's very pervasive. It's in pretty much everything from the containers that you get your medication in to the stupid cellophane wrapping that they have on cucumbers. It's everywhere. And there's a figure in this paper, figure number 3, that just shows you how far-reaching the impacts of this chemical are. I mean, they're changing adipocyte differentiation, and I think that's really important because if we go back to that first review article, the way that the fat cells differentiate and the type of fat cells is really important in the pathogenesis of obesity. It's also changing the gut microbiome, and I think this is a field that's really starting to develop, and we're starting to understand that the little brain, or now potentially the big brain that lives inside our gut, has a big role to play in obesity and in a bunch of other different non-communicable diseases. But for me, there's 3 takeaways. Reduce your exposure to these products where you can. So if having non-nutritive sweeteners is your vice, maybe skip 1 or 2 of those a week. Reduce the amount that you're eating. If you tend to take your food to work in a plastic container, don't pop that straight into the microwave. If you can, put it onto a plate and then heat it up. Or if you can switch to stainless steel and glass containers, all the better. And especially around sort of fatty food. So if you're eating salmon and nuts and foods that you've cooked in olive oil, when those sit in plastic containers for a long period of time, that leaching or that migration from the plastic into the food tends to get quite a lot worse. So thinking about stuff like that. And I think for me, although yes, BPAs and phytolates and additives are regulated within the food supply chain, and there is some understanding that they have an impact, and we've definitely gotten better around BPA, and you'll see this is BPA free and that's BPA free. There's still a few things that concern me. And the first thing is the fact that these toxicity thresholds are based on one chemical at a time. So it doesn't account for the cumulative effects of several different chemicals. So are you exposed to BPA? Yes. Okay. Well, this is the threshold for BPA. But what's the threshold for BPA and we just don't know that because it's really complicated to measure. The
Yeah, and
second
also
thing,
those thresholds based on also the idea that you're actually presenting with some disease or with
yes,
some toxicity, whereas it's like
yes.
actually, where did things start to develop? Because presumably things aren't going well before that.
Absolutely. So I think that's the other interesting part, is that these thresholds are based their toxicity levels. So something is going severely wrong by the time you get to this point. But what a lot of authors in the field are now actually arguing for is the fact that at a lower threshold, many of these chemicals are actually neuroendocrine disrupting, and there's things going wrong way before we actually even see anything. And the other thing that's really interesting is that they don't account for the byproducts of these chemicals when they're heated or they're cooled or they're on a shelf for a long period of time. And we know that changing the environment, especially temperature, has an impact on different byproducts from chemicals. And the last thing is there's over 12,000 chemicals in the food supply chain. So from plastic packaging to everything else. And we don't actually fully understand the toxicological effects of all of those. Only a small subset do we understand. So I think the idea of, it goes back to the drum we've been beating forever, shopping around the outside of the supermarket, where you can, shopping at farmers markets and buying food that isn't wrapped in plastic, getting home and decanting that food straight into glass bottles or stainless steel containers rather than keeping it in the plastic bags that it came in. So just trying to do all those little things that you can to reduce your exposure.
So there's a couple of things I want to ask. The first is around BPA as an estrogen disruptor. So I think, is it more likely to affect women than men, or that's just an extra nail on the coffin, sort of, so to speak?
Yeah, I'm not very familiar with the differential effects based on sex, but I think that either way, it's going to be disrupting um, estrogen levels because it is estrogen mimicking.
Yeah, and men have some estrogen as well. Of course.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's one thing. The second thing is on my mismatched template, which I like to use. Well, my goodness, I mean, 12,000 chemicals, none of which were in our food supply until recently, like none.
Yeah.
Second of all, what to do about it? Because actually, as much as you regulate, we're probably not going to get foods out of packets. Second of all, we've produced so much plastic, as just one example, over
Yes.
the last 100, well, I don't know, when was plastic invented? I can't remember, but it's only been around 50, 80 years, hasn't it? Yeah, this is a useful, ubiquitous material. I mean, look around, you read me out, Kayla. I bet you've got plastic everywhere. I certainly have.
Yeah,
And,
absolutely.
and it's sort of useful, right? But gosh, we're just going to keep producing it. We're not talking about that at all. And it's in our food supply now. So you catch a fish, it's still got these have got these chemicals in them. They're in the environment, and they will continue to get worse. So, gosh, we've got a problem here, haven't we, folks?
We've got a huge problem. And I think one of my favorite statistics is the fact that at any given time, any person has the equivalent of a credit card's worth of plastic inside of them. And that's because plastic is just so pervasive. It's everywhere we look. And if we start looking at the idea of sustainability, and we talk about eco nutrition and making sure that the way that populations eat is aligned with a sustainable approach, to saving the world, really. So make sure everyone is nourished, but that the world is going to continue to sustain itself. Then surely we want to be stepping away from foods that are harming our environment and harming the people and animals that live in it.
Yeah. I mean, I've sort of felt that the climate change argument is so one dimensional around carbon,
Yeah.
and I suppose methane as well. But the fact is, we're wrecking the planet with rubbish. We're trashing it literally, and that was the Pixar film Wall-E, which in the late 90s really predicted that was the future. perspective. And I think unfortunately we're going this way. But the other tension for me here, Kayla, being a professor of public health, is that you're trying to always talk about and want to advocate for public policy and be optimistic about what we can do. And, that's really the mantra in my field. And issue annoys me sometimes. We can do this and this will sort this. And in this case, I just think it's going to get worse. I've got no solution to it. You're giving tips for people, but man, the sort of global food supply, the way we do food, the way the population's going, the way we do rubbish and trash. So we've tried to have low rubbish projects in our family, and we're trying, guys. And I know people go, we did this and we only have this, and more power to you, but we haven't been able to get there.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think it speaks to the fact that in order for us to come up with a solution where we're at a point where we're eating good food and we're protecting the planet, it's not just on the man, so to speak. We can't just look at it from an individual level. We need food technologists, dietitians, public health, policy, big food all coming together. And I think that's where the real issue is that big food, so to speak, which in my opinion is more pervasive and dangerous than big pharma.
Big
Really,
cool, probably true.
yeah. And it really is everywhere. Like there was a paper just a wee while ago published that looked at the conflict of interest on the boards that decide dietary guidelines, and 95% of the committee members on this specific board had a stake in big food. So obviously they're going to be pushing for dietary guidelines to include processed and packaged foods.
Yeah, I saw that paper come out just this week. So yeah, it's another thing, isn't it? All right, well, we don't want to be unoptimistic, but let us know your ideas about how to solve this problem of additives and bisphenols and formaldehydes and artificial sweeteners and all of the glycophosphates and the things that are going into food. How do we solve this problem as a society beyond you already committed individuals? Love to hear from you. Remember, if you want to ask a question, make a comment, start to get involved in the AMA podcast with Kayla and I, info@PREKURE.com. Thanks, Kayla. That'll wrap us for today.
Thanks, Grant.